Hi boys and girls. Today we're going to read about Frédéric Chopin. Here's his caricature. And if you are listening to this series of composers, I just want you don't have to write anything down, but just kind of think about trends. You know how we talk about the icons of depth and complexity? And so you might want to think about, so far we've done Vivaldi, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin. And so you might want to think about some trends, some traits, some characteristics that are similar, and then maybe some differences, okay? But there are some similarities between them, and then there's some differences. So Frédéric Chopin is from Poland, which so far the composers we've read about have been from Italy and Germany. So he was from Poland. He loved his homeland. Very, very, I guess you'd say, patriotic. He was born in 1810, and he died in Paris in 1849. All right? So we're going to start. Even as a child, Chopin was terribly sensitive and almost not quite of this world. His family was musical, and when he was a baby, he would cry from pleasure with the beautiful sounds that his family would make as they played music. The family pampered him and adored him. He had 3 sisters. He's the only boy. So he'd play with his sisters. He would go ice skating with them. His first piano teacher was his older sister, Louisa, and she was 7. With another sister, he started the Literacy Amusement Association at age 14. It was a newspaper full of funny stories and daily events, and it was really just his diary. His life revolved around music. He started playing at age 4, and by the age 8, he started performing. Wondering what people thought about his velvet jacket, perhaps, about his music. So I don't know, I guess he was concerned about his clothing. He began publishing his own composition in his teens, and Robert Schumann, who was an older composer at the time, said, "Hats off, gentlemen, we have a genius here." And Chopin also had a sense of humor. He would play kind of practical jokes. Sometimes he'd play real soft at his concerts, and people would fall asleep, and then he'd come in really loud on an accented note and wake them up. He had very deep feelings for Poland, as I said before, and he left when he was 20, and he actually took a silver cup full of dirt from Poland. Much of the music he went on to write, the waltzes, the mazurkas, recreated feelings and sounds from his childhood in Poland. People would say that he looked like his music, which you have to think about that for a minute. It's sort of abstract. He was pale, handsome, unhealthy. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His black silky hair hung in locks on his forehead. He had a sweet smile and a big nose. He used to say his nose was huge. He carried himself proudly as a prince, and he never swore, and he was never crude. And one of his friends said, "He is no man, he's an angel, he's a god." But on the other side of that, on the flip side, he was not always so charming. He could be temperamental, full of fantasies, and he could be unreliable. He could be suspicious, and he could be self-centered. And his wit could be malicious. So in other words, he could make a cutting comment to a person, and it wasn't nice. It was malicious. If you don't know what that means, you can look it up. His feelings were easily hurt, and some days if his feelings got hurt, he could actually sulk the entire day. He had some funny quirks. He couldn't sleep unless his slippers were lined up in front of the bed. He never entered a room left foot first. Okay, so if he walked into a room, he had to come in with his right foot first. Nowadays, people might call that obsessive compulsive disorder, but back then they didn't have names for those kinds of things. Sudden surprises, even a servant coming into the room, would make his hair stand on end. He couldn't tolerate the smell of cigarette smoke. It made him sick, and he was too delicate to drink coffee or wine, but he liked milk. He would only eat certain foods: breads, pastries, chicken, and fish. He had a horror of being buried alive. And so on his deathbed, he asked to be cut. After he died, he wanted them to cut him to make sure he was dead. Bach and Mozart were the only composers Chopin loved, without reservation. And before he would give a concert, he'd warm up, he'd practice Bach. He wasn't crazy about other composers. He wasn't a big reader, but all the famous musicians and writers of the time were his friends. After being introduced to each other by composer Franz Liszt, he met George Sand, who was a woman, and they dated And let's see, she was a famous French novelist, 6 years older than Chopin. And the reason she went by that name is because back then, if you were a woman and you wrote books or you wrote music, if you used your female name, people wouldn't buy your book and people wouldn't buy your music. So she would call him Chop as a nickname, or Chip Chip, or My Little Complainer. And he kept a lock of her hair in his diary till the day he died. Chopin got his ideas quickly while walking or playing the piano, but he locked himself in his room for days at a time to perfect them, weeping, pacing like a madman, breaking pens. He could work for 6 weeks on a single page of music. Often he wrote in the middle of the night. He had a piano in his bedroom, much to the neighbors' bewilderment. He does not know on what planet he exists, said Sand, his girlfriend, of those times. So he would just go into this, phase of creativity. Chopin was one of the greatest pianists in history. He, as well as Franz Liszt, but Chopin was just a phenomenal piano player. His small, delicate hands were like velvet fingers, played softly but hypnotically. His feet were in constant motion, using the pedals so rapidly that his legs appeared to be vibrating. He hated large public performances, but the private concerts he held for friends became legendary. One concert he played by moonlight, for a moth had fallen into the lamp and extinguished the flame. To relieve the serious mood his playing evoked, he would break into imitations. He was an excellent mimic, and some friends thought he should give up piano for acting. He never missed an opening night at the theater. I'm a revolutionary. Money means nothing to me, Chopin said. Still, he didn't seem to mind having it. He supported himself by teaching 5 lessons a day, for which countesses, baronesses, and princes would pay him well. They would enter his studio and place their money on the mantel while he looked out the window. He thought a true gentleman did not touch money. He lived in luxury. He had a servant, his own horse and carriage, which back then, boys and girls, that was really expensive. We don't think of it like that, but you had to have money to have a horse and a carriage. And his clothes were from all the best, finest shops. Blue velvet coats, silk shirts, diamond stick pins, white leather gloves, made to order, flowing black cloak lined with gray satin. He liked to have vases of violets around his rooms, and even handkerchiefs. He was always sickly, and he died of tuberculosis at 39. And again, that's one of those diseases that people don't die of nowadays, but back then it could kill you. Let's see. His last words were, "Play Mozart in memory of me." He was buried in La Père Lachaise. It's a cemetery in Paris. If you ever go, I have never been, but I'd love to go. But it's where a lot of famous musicians were buried. Also, just a lot of famous writers. So it's really a beautiful cemetery. The legend is that Chopin's silver cup of Polish dirt was poured on his grave, and that's just a legend. We don't know if it's true. Ever since, people say not a day goes by without somebody putting fresh flowers on his grave. He was a legend in his own time, and his compositions have never gone out of fashion. If you get a chance, maybe you can go to Pandora and listen to Chopin. It's very relaxing, especially if you listen to his waltzes. Very relaxing. So I hope things are going well for you. Until next time.